Hello everyone and welcome to the fifth episode of PeopleSoft Procure to Pay series by PeopleSoft channel. In today's episode, we will start our discussion about requisition sourcing and we will see how to source a requisition into purchase order using delivered processes. In the previous episode, we saw a couple of examples of how to perform requisition approval at header level and at line level, and we discussed how to set up the approval processes for requisition. In today's episode, we are going to have an overview of the requisition sourcing process, and we will see one of the method of how to manually source a requisition into purchase order. Alright, so with that agenda in mind for today, let's start the discussion. In PeopleSoft system, a requisition can be sourced into one of the two documents. So it can be sourced into a material stock request, also called as MSR, or it can be sourced into a purchase order, which is also called as PO. So to source a requisition into material stock request, we use the build inventory demand process, and there are a couple of prerequisites. For example, the item must be an inventory item. We need to have the inventory set up in the system. We need to have enough quantities of that item into the inventory, and for the particular ship to location, we need to have a distribution network set up. So these are some of the requirements, and we will discuss about sourcing a requisition into an MSR in subsequent lectures. But for this episode, we will stick to sourcing a requisition into purchase order. So when we think about the eligibility of requisition for sourcing, then the requisition must be in approved status to be sourced into a purchase order. So if you have a requisition which is open or pending approval, then it is not eligible to source into a purchase order. We have one more criteria which is called as budget checked. And as you can see, I have mentioned it as optional. So why it is optional is that in PeopleSoft system, you have a module called as commitment control, which checks about the budget availability for your transaction. So if you have a budget of $100 and if you are creating a requisition less than 100, then its budget status will be valid and the requisition will be eligible. However, if your requisition amount crosses the available budget, then the budget status will not be valid. In that case, the requisition will not be eligible to source into purchase order. So just to give you some idea about commitment control, we can see the installation options here. We need to go to Setup Financials Supply Chain, then Install, and then Installation Options. Here we will go into this products link. And then you can see we have this enable commitment control options, and these are the several modules in which we can enable commitment control. As you can see in my demo environment, commitment control is enabled for purchasing. Hence, I would need to perform the budget check process for our requisition. So let's see one example of how to perform budget check. So this is one of the requisition and it is in approved status. As you can see, the budget status is not checked. So let's click on this button to perform the budget check for this requisition. So as we click on this button, we can see a process fs_pp is triggered. This is the delivered process which performs the budget check operation. So the process has been completed successfully and we can see the budget status is valid. Hence, as the requisition is in approved status and valid budget status, this requisition now is eligible for sourcing into purchase order. So when it comes to sourcing a requisition into purchase order, there are two methods to perform this operation. The first method is by running the three processes individually, one after the another, and the second method is running just one process to obtain the purchase order. As you can see, in the first method, we will first run the requisition selection process, which is followed by PO calculation process, which is followed by the PO creation process, and finally, once PO creation process is successful, then we get a purchase order for our requisition. In the second method, instead of running these three processes individually, we need to run just one process, which is PO auto source, and after running the one process, we get our purchase order in PeopleSoft. In today's episode, we will see the first method in which we will run these three processes, and in the next episode, we will see the second method of obtaining a purchase order using PO auto source. So one important thing to understand is that these processes needs to be run in these sequence only. Alright, so let's start with the method 1 and let's understand the requisition selection process. So requisition selection is a process which selects the requisition and put its data into PO staging tables. So let's understand with an example. So you have requisition and your requisition tables, which are header, line, ship, and distrib, and your ultimate aim is to create the purchase order against this requisition. So the ultimate aim is to populate the PO tables using these requisition. The question is, does the system populates the PO table directly from the requisition tables? Well, the answer is no, it does not work like this. The system uses something called as PO staging tables. So staging table means an intermediary tables or a temporary tables which are used for temporary purpose to perform some calculations, and once everything is right, then from the temporary table the main PO tables are populated. So the purpose of requisition selection process is to select the requisition and put its data into PO staging tables, so that the system can use these data into staging tables to perform data transformation or to clean the data. And once everything is right, that means once there is no error against the transaction, then using the PO staging tables, the system populates the main PO tables. And this is when we see that a PO has been created for our requisition. So let's see one example of requisition selection. So let's try to source this requisition, which is requisition 257. So in order to run the requisition selection process, we need to go to purchasing, purchase order, stage source request, and then requisition selection. So here we need to provide the requisition ID. So we have provided the business unit, and let's provide the requisition ID and let's search. Now this requisition has two lines and we can see both of these lines available for sourcing. So now what we will do is we would put the requisition into staging tables using the requisition selection process. If you check the database, there are three main PO staging tables which are used. The first one is PO header stage table, the second one is PO item stage, and the third one is PO distrib stage. So if you check now for our requisition into these three tables, let's check with PO item stage, and we do not have any data. And similarly for PO distro stage, we do not have data for this requisition. Now we will run the requisition selection to select this requisition and put it into staging table. To perform this operation, we need to select this checkbox to include this line, and then let's select both of them and let's save it. So once we save it, we are taking the requisition and putting its data into PO staging tables. So if we check the PO staging tables now, let's say we check the PO item stage table. Now we have data against the requisition for 2 lines. And similarly, if we check the PO distrib stage table, then we can see the 2 lines for our requisition. There is an important field called as PO stage ID, and this will be used to source the requisition into purchase table. Right now we can see the stage status is S. That means these rows are ready to process. Now we as a developer check the data into staging tables using the SQL developer. But what if the business user wants to check what is there into staging tables? He may not have access to the SQL developer. In that case, he can use something called as sourcing workbench to see what is there currently into staging tables. So to go to sourcing workbench, we need to go to purchasing, purchase order, stage source request, and sourcing workbench. So using sourcing workbench, we can see what is there right now into PO staging tables. Okay. So if we want to search for a particular requisition, let's say we need to search for this requisition, we can provide the business unit and the requisition ID. And if you click on search, we can see there are 2 rows of data. These are nothing but 2 lines of our requisition, and the stage status is staged. You can see purchase order is unassigned. This is because no PO ID has been created yet. PO will be created once we run the third process, which is PO creation. So we use this sourcing workbench to see what is there currently into staging tables. Now, another useful feature of sourcing workbench is that it allows you to change the data for your requisition into staging table so that the PO will be created using the new data or new parameters. For example, for this requisition, we have 2 lines as you can see, and both of them have the same supplier. Now, for some reason you want to change the supplier for the second line, then you can do this using sourcing workbench. So if you click on the details, then you have the stage supplier here. That means the current supplier in the staging tables. Now, if you wish to change that supplier, you can do it from here and you can click on save. So the PO will be created for this requisition using this new supplier. So for now, I will not change the supplier and I will go back to sourcing workbench. Now the next process in requisition sourcing is the PO calculation process. So PO calculation process is used to calculate the PO parameters or convert the parameters into supplier's parameter so that a valid PO can be created for the supplier. Now, what do we mean by that? Let's see one example. So our requisition have 2 items and both the items have the unit of measure as each. So right now we are ordering 300 each of first item and 200 each of the second item. Now this unit of measure is coming from the item setup that we have done in PeopleSoft system. But suppose the supplier who sells this item deals in the unit of measure called as dozen. So the conversion factor is like 12 each equal to 1 dozen. Since the PO is getting created for the supplier, and if the supplier works in the unit of measure dozen for this item, then we need to convert the unit of measure for this item from each to dozen. In that case, the quantity will be 25 instead of 300 because 300 each equals to 25 dozen. So this conversion is done with the help of PO calculation process. Similarly, this price that we are seeing here is the merchandise amount based upon the item quantity and price per item. But what if the supplier may incur some additional charges to ship the item? This is also called as shipping charges or freight terms. So these charges are calculated using the PO calculation process. To give you another example, the supplier may transact in some other currency. For example, right now we are dealing in the currency US dollars, as you can see, but the supplier may transact in euro or pounds. In that case, PO calculation process helps us to convert the currency as per requirement. So if you would like to know more about the PO calculation process, then here are the 12 functions of the PO calculation process which are available under the People book. And you can see that it helps us to select a vendor when multiple suppliers are present. It helps us to calculate a due date if we have not provided it on the schedule of the requisition. It helps us to determine the purchase order currency because the transaction may happen in multiple currencies such as US dollars or euros or pounds. Also, it helps us to convert the item's unit of measure to the vendor unit of measure if necessary. Also, one of the important factor is that if your organization is using a contract and the item which you are ordering in the requisition, if it is a part of some contract, then the calculation process allows us to find such contract for the item. Alright, so you can see the functions of the PO calculation process on this People book page. To run the PO calculation process, we need to go to purchasing, purchase order, state source request, and PO calculation. So let us provide a run control ID, and then this is the PO calculation page. Now first we have the PO calculation selection criteria. So right now your staging table may have hundreds of requisitions. So if you want to pick up only those requisitions meeting a specific criteria, then you can use the PO selection criteria to provide the values. For example, right now for this requisition, for both the items I have buyer as Veronica Atkins. So I can use this criteria to provide the buyer ID here so that only those items for which the buyer is Veronica Atkins will be picked up. Now another important point on the PO calculation process is the calculation process options. So we have the consolidation method options here, and we have two options. First is business unit supplier and second is business unit supplier and buyer. So if we have multiple requisitions into staging table which meets this criteria, then this option allows us to consolidate multiple requisitions into a single. So if we have the same business unit and same supplier, then we can consolidate those requisitions into one purchase order. And the second method is if we have same business unit, same supplier and same buyer for multiple requisitions and their lines, then using the second options we can consolidate those requisitions into a single purchase order. Right now I will keep it as business unit and supplier. Next is the origin, and here we are saying that the origin for this PO should be online, and we can also provide the purchase order date and the purchase order reference. Now we also have the build POs as approved. This checkbox is present. That means when the purchase order will be created using these method, then it will have the approval status as approved. So why do we need this option is that we are already controlling the approval at the requisition level. So if the requisition itself has already received the approval, then there is no point in getting a separate approval for PO. In that case, we can check this checkbox. And for our PO which will be created, we have mentioned that buyer is going to be VP1. So let's run the PO calculation process. So we will click on the run, and this is the delivered application engine PO_POLC provided by PeopleSoft to perform the PO calculation. So let's run it, and we got the process instance here as 212855. So if we check the sourcing workbench, then we can see that as of now the instance is 0 for both the lines of this requisition. Now if we go to process monitor, we can see the application engine is in processing status. So let's wait for the process to complete. And now we can see the process has been completed successfully. Now if we go to sourcing workbench and if we check the requisition, this time we will have the instance available for both the lines. And you can also see the stage status, which was earlier staged, now has been changed to ready to create. So these are the different status which a transaction can have in the staging table. Earlier it was staged and we completed the PO calculation. So all the calculations as we discussed earlier were done for these two rows of data, and now these two rows of data are in ready to create status, and this instance is coming from the PO calculation process. Right now we can see the purchase order is still unassigned. That means PO is yet to be created. Now let's run the final process called as PO creation process to create PO out of the stage data in staging table. So to run the PO creation process, we need to go to purchasing, purchase order, stage source request, and then PO creation process. This process is used to create PO out of the data present in the staging tables. So let's provide a run control ID. And now we have the PO creation selection criteria. So we may have lots of requisition lines present in the staging table. So we can provide some criteria based upon our requirement, and only those transaction lines which matches this criteria will be picked up while creating the purchase order. Now we have the criteria such as we can provide the process instance, or we can provide a couple of business units, or we can provide a particular buyer ID. Now we will go with the process instance here. So here if you see, we have the process instance, this which is coming from the PO calculation process in which this transaction has been calculated. So we will use this process instance here as a selection criteria for PO creation. So we provided this process instance. Let's save it and let's run the PO creation process. So this is the delivered application engine provided by PeopleSoft. It is PO_PO create, and it is used to create purchase orders. So let's click on OK, and now we have got the process instance. So if we check the process monitor, this PO create process is currently in queue status. So let's wait for this process to complete successfully. So now the PO create process has been completed successfully. So if we go back to sourcing workbench, we earlier had the status as ready to create, purchase order unassigned, and this process instance from the PO calculation process. But if we perform a search now, this time we have a different process instance. This is coming from the PO creation process. We can see the state status is completed, and finally we can see the purchase order has been created for this requisition. So if we wish to check the purchase order, we can click on this purchase order, and this will open the purchase order in the add update component of the PO. So this is the purchase order. As we can see, the PO status is approved because remember we had checked the checkbox in the PO calculation, build POs as approved, and these are the two lines which we had on the requisition. Now an important field in the purchase order is this PO reference. If you see, we have the comment online source from requisition 257. It is nothing but the requisition on which we were working, and this comment signifies that this purchase order has been sourced from this requisition using the online processes. So this is the first method using which we can create a purchase order. Now let's understand how we can see whether a purchase order has been created for the given requisition. Well, there are a couple of ways to obtain this information. If we are checking online, then we need to go to purchasing, then requisition, then review requisition information, and then document status. So let's take this requisition ID and let's search with the requisition ID. So you can see one document associated with this requisition, and that document will be purchase order. So document status is a very useful component which shows all the documents which are associated with this requisition. So right now we have a purchase order, but in future as we progress this transaction, we might have receipts associated with the purchase order which is linked to this requisition. We may have vouchers, we may have payments, or we may have RTVs. So document status is a useful way to identify whether a PO has been created for this requisition or not. So another way to obtain a PO information for the given requisition is by using a SQL. So we will query the PSPO line descript table, and we will provide the business unit and requisition ID. So if we run this SQL, we can see a PO ID has been created with these two lines. Alright guys, that's it for today's episode. In the next episode, we will see the second method of sourcing a requisition, that is by using the PO auto source process. See you in the next episode. Thank you.